Okay, today we're going to talk about this side of the quadrilateral family tree, the trapezoid and kite side of it. So again, only thing you need to know about a quadrilateral is that it has 4 sides, 4 angles, and then we can break it down to the different characteristics. And so looking at this family tree, notice that parallelogram and trapezoid aren't connected. They're only connected to the quadrilateral, which means the only thing they have in common is that they have 4 sides. So we have new characteristics to talk about here. So let's go to the section for trapezoids. We're going to talk about 2 different types of trapezoids. We're going to start with just a basic trapezoid, and then we'll get into a specific kind of trapezoid. So go ahead and draw a picture. I would say start with something that looks kind of like this. Maybe if it'll let me do it at a diagonal. There we go. Okay, not perfect, but pretty close to what I need. So the first thing we're going to talk about are sides again. So with sides, the only characteristic we know with a trapezoid, just any trapezoid out there, is that you have one set that is parallel. So you have one set of sides that is parallel. I'm going to underline that. One pair instead of both. None of the sides are congruent here. They could be, but it's not a guaranteed characteristic. The next thing we're going to talk about are the angles. And so what we have here is on our parallelogram side of it, we talked about consecutive angles and we could go all the way around the shape. Well, we can't here. We only have 2 sets. So these 2 right here, so let's call them angle 1 and angle 2, they're going to add up to 180. And we could also say 3 and 4 also add up to 180. Okay, so you only have 2 sets here. You can't go all the way around the shape. So we're going to write here we have 2 pair of consecutive angles equals 180. And remember, if we're talking about something being supplementary, adding up to 180, we can always say part plus part equals 180. And if you even need to go a step further and say, for an example down here, angle 1 plus angle 2 equals 180 degrees, and angle 3 and angle 4. And there are no characteristics about diagonals, so you only have the 2 characteristics for just a general trapezoid. So let's move on to an isosceles trapezoid. We talked about isosceles triangles, and that meant that 2 sides are the same. Well, it's also going to be the same thing with the trapezoid. 2 sides are going to be the same. So the way an isosceles trapezoid is set up looks like this. It's kind of your typical trapezoid that you grew up seeing. Looks kind of like the lampshade. And remember, because it's a trapezoid, we pass down those 2 characteristics from the regular trapezoid. So opposite sides are parallel, but only one set this time. And our legs are congruent. Okay, the legs are the ones that are not congruent. Those are the bases, okay? So you might even write out here to the side leg and base. The legs are the congruent ones, the bases are the parallel ones, okay? So let's say the bases are parallel and the legs are congruent. And if they're congruent, we know it's part equals part. Okay, just like a general trapezoid, we know we have 2 sets of consecutive, so we can bring that down. Okay, but we also have base angles here, and our base angles and an isosceles trapezoid are congruent. So those two right there that I just marked are congruent, and those two are congruent. So let's jot that down. We have 2 pair of consecutive angles. We know part plus part equals 180. And we also know that base angles are congruent, which we could use part equals part again. Remember, bases are the parallel sides, so each angle at the end of each base are congruent. Okay, we do have a characteristic for the diagonals, so let's go ahead and draw those in. And the diagonals in an isosceles trapezoid are congruent. So it's kind of hard to mark this because it does intersect. It's not bisecting, it is intersecting. So it might be handy just to maybe highlight those two to remind yourself something about them, that they are congruent. So we will say down here that the diagonals are congruent. Which means we can use part equals part. Okay, so that's the trapezoid side of things. Now we're going to go to the last section, kite. And remember, if we go back to our family tree, kite is separate from the parallelogram and it's separate from the trapezoid. So it has its own set of characteristics that do not relate to the other two. So go ahead and go to the last section here for kites. Let's go ahead and draw a kite. So make these two sides right here smaller than those two at the bottom. Okay, in a kite, the only characteristic we have about sides is that the consecutive sides are congruent. So these two up here are the same, and these two down here are the same. Consecutive again means they are next to each other. And again, you can set up part equals part. Okay, we only have one pair of opposite angles that are congruent, and those are right here. Let me change colors. So here and here. So one pair of opposite angles are congruent. Again, part equals part. We do have diagonals with some characteristics, so go ahead and draw those diagonals. Okay, the first thing that you need to know about those diagonals is that they are perpendicular. So again, we have right triangles. So that's why we spent so much time talking about right triangles, because those right triangles are going to pop up in your other shapes. The last thing about the diagonals is that this line right here in pink has been bisected. So we can say that this piece is the same as that piece. Okay, so let's go ahead and write those characteristics down. First one was that they are perpendicular, which means you have your right angles. And one diagonal was bisected. And those are your characteristics of kites. So again, just like with parallelograms, use these pictures and use these markings to figure out what is congruent, where are your right angles, things like that.